The billionaire's baby wailed nonstop on the flight, turning first class into chaos. Frustrated passengers complained as tech mogul Richard Peaton desperately tried bottles, pacifiers. Nothing worked. From economy, elderly Dorothy Washington, a seasoned caregiver, recognized severe colic and rose to help, defying class barriers. Her intervention promised an unthinkable twist of wisdom over wealth. The transatlantic flight from New York to London was supposed to be a serene journey through the clouds, a luxurious escape for those who could afford the premium seats. But 3 hours into the flight, the first-class cabin had transformed into a battlefield of frayed nerves and piercing wails. At the center of it all was a tiny 6-month-old baby, his cries echoing like a siren that no one could silence. The sound was relentless, a high-pitched symphony of distress that vibrated through the plush leather seats and rattled the crystal glasses on the trays. Passengers who had paid thousands for peace were now covering their ears, their faces twisted in annoyance and exhaustion. "For heaven's sake, shut that child up!" barked a sharply dressed businessman from across the aisle, his voice cutting through the din like a knife. Others nodded in agreement, their murmurs growing into a chorus of complaints. The air was thick with tension, the kind that builds when privilege meets inconvenience, and no amount of complimentary champagne could drown it out. In the midst of the chaos stood Richard Peaton, the tech billionaire whose empire spanned continents and whose fortune was whispered to be in the billions. He cradled his son, Lucas, with hands more accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar deals than soothing a distraught infant. Richard's usually composed demeanor was crumbling. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he rocked the baby back and forth. His designer suit rumpled from the effort. The flight attendants hovered nearby, their professional smiles strained as they offered yet another bottle, a pacifier, even a toy from the onboard kit. But nothing worked. Lucas's face was flushed crimson, his tiny fists clenched in agony, his cries escalating with each failed attempt. "We've tried everything, Mr. Peaton," one attendant whispered apologetically, her voice barely audible over the noise. Richard shot her a desperate glance, his eyes pleading for a miracle that seemed impossible at 30,000 feet. The other passengers were losing patience. A blonde woman in a silk blouse dramatically plugged her ears with noise-canceling headphones, while an elderly couple exchanged disapproving shakes of their heads. The cabin, once a haven of opulence with its ambient lighting and gourmet snacks, now felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. From the dimmer confines of economy class, far at the back of the plane, the cries carried like a distant storm. Seats were crammed together, passengers elbow to elbow, but one woman sat undisturbed, her gray hair neatly pinned, her worn cardigan a stark contrast to the first-class finery. Dorothy Washington, 72 years old and no stranger to hardship, listened intently. She had spent her life navigating worlds divided by wealth and color, raising children in the shadows of Manhattan's skyscrapers, while the elite lived above. As the baby's wails pierced the curtain separating the classes, Dorothy's experienced ears picked up nuances others missed. The sharp intake of breath, the rhythmic urgency that spoke of something deeper than mere hunger or fatigue. She closed her old magazine, her calloused hands steady, and whispered to herself, "That ain't just any cry." The plane droned on. But in that moment, the seeds of an unthinkable intervention were sown, one that would bridge divides and shatter assumptions in ways no one could foresee. The unrest in first class spilled over, with passengers now openly venting their frustrations. "I have a crucial meeting tomorrow. I can't arrive like this," the blonde woman exclaimed, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on her armrest. Richard, feeling the weight of judgmental stares, snapped back, "Do you think I want this?" "I'm doing everything I can." His voice cracked with a mix of anger and shame, a rare vulnerability for a man who commanded boardrooms with ease. The attendants exchanged helpless glances, protocol binding their hands as tightly as the seatbelts. Meanwhile, in economy, Dorothy rose slowly from her seat, her joints protesting the long flight, but her resolve unwavering. She smoothed her skirt and began her quiet walk down the aisle, drawn by an instinct honed over decades. The curtain loomed ahead, a symbolic barrier between worlds, but Dorothy knew suffering knew no such boundaries. As the cries reached a fever pitch, the stage was set for a collision of lives that would redefine what it meant to be truly wealthy. Richard Peaton wasn't just any passenger. He was a titan of the tech world, the kind of man whose name appeared in Forbes lists and whose decisions influenced global markets. At 45, he had built his fortune from a garage startup into a multinational conglomerate specializing in AI and cybersecurity. His life was a whirlwind of private jets, exclusive galas, and high-stakes negotiations, but nothing had prepared him for fatherhood. Lucas, his only child, was the result of a whirlwind romance with a model who had since vanished from their lives, leaving Richard to navigate single parenthood amid his empire building. On this flight, he was en route to a major investor meeting in London, but the baby's incessant crying had turned his carefully planned trip into a nightmare. He bounced Lucas gently, whispering soothing words that fell on deaf ears, his mind racing through every parenting app and book he'd skimmed in his rare free moments. Despair etched deeper into Richard's features as the hours ticked by. He had tried everything in his arsenal. Warm milk from the galley, classical music piped through his phone, even a desperate call to his pediatrician back home via the plane's Wi-Fi. But the connection was spotty, and the advice generic. Check for diaper issues, burp him, try white noise. Richard had done it all, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the tiny onesie. The shame burned hot. Here he was, a man who had outmaneuvered competitors worth billions, reduced to helplessness by a 6-month-old. "Come on, buddy, please," he murmured, his voice hoarse. The blonde passenger shot him another glare, her patience evaporated. "Some of us are trying to work here," she huffed, typing furiously on her laptop. Richard's cheeks flushed. He wasn't used to failure, especially not in public. His empire had been built on control, on solving problems with innovation and resources, but this was primal, beyond his gadgets and algorithms. As the cries intensified, Richard's thoughts drifted to his own upbringing, a modest home in the Midwest, where his parents had worked double shifts to afford his education. He had clawed his way to the top, vowing never to feel powerless again. Yet here, at 30,000 feet, power meant nothing. The flight attendant approached again, her face sympathetic but weary. "Sir, perhaps we can move you to a quieter area?" But there was no quieter area. The plane was full, and the sound carried everywhere. Richard shook his head, clutching Lucas tighter, feeling the judgmental eyes like daggers. A middle-aged executive nearby muttered, "If you can't handle a kid, don't bring one on a plane." The words stung, amplifying Richard's isolation. He glanced toward the curtain, wondering if anyone beyond it might have mercy or insight he lacked. The chaos rippled outward, affecting even the crew. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, apologizing for the disturbance and promising smoother skies ahead. But no turbulence matched the emotional storm in first class. Richard's phone buzzed with emails from his team, urgent matters he couldn't address amid the noise. His empire waited, but fatherhood demanded precedence, a lesson he was learning the hard way. In his desperation, he barked at an attendant. "Isn't there a doctor on board? Someone? Anyone?" The plea hung in the air, unanswered, as Lucas's wails peaked, his little body rigid with pain. Richard's world, once vast and commanding, had shrunk to this single, unsolvable crisis. Unbeknownst to him, help was approaching from an unlikely source. But in that moment, Richard embodied every parent's worst fear: the inability to ease their child's suffering. His billions couldn't buy silence, and his authority couldn't command calm. As the plane hurtled through the night, Richard Peaton, the unbreakable mogul, teetered on the edge of breaking, setting the stage for a revelation that would challenge everything he knew about worth and wisdom. Tucked away in the last row of economy, Dorothy Washington sat like a quiet sentinel, her life a tapestry of resilience woven through decades of service and survival. At 72, her face bore the lines of laughter and loss, her gray hair a crown of earned wisdom. Born in the segregated South, she had migrated north as a young woman, finding work in the homes of Manhattan's elite. She raised 7 children of her own while nannying for families who saw her as indispensable yet invisible. 16 grandchildren later, Dorothy's hands had soothed countless cries, her intuition sharper than any textbook. Now retired, she was flying to visit a daughter in London, her economy ticket a reminder of a life lived modestly, despite her profound impact. As Lucas's cries filtered back, Dorothy's ears perked up. It wasn't the wail of tiredness or hunger. It was sharper, more insistent. A telltale sign of colic, perhaps exacerbated by the cabin pressure. She had heard it before in the opulent nurseries where she worked, calming babies while their parents attended galas. Her magazine lay forgotten as she focused, her mind cataloging the rhythm, the gasps, the arches in pitch. "Poor little one," she murmured, her voice lost in the hum of the engines. Around her, economy passengers grumbled too, but with less venom. Many were parents themselves, empathetic to the plight. Dorothy's seatmate, a young mother, sighed. "That sounds bad. Hope they figure it out." Dorothy's backstory flashed in her mind. Years in neonatal care as a nurse, developing techniques for fussy infants that doctors later adopted. But she never boasted. Her value lay in action, not acclaim. She watched the curtain flutter, imagining the scene beyond. Flustered attendants, irritated elites, a father out of his depth. Her calloused fingers drummed lightly on her knee, a habit from rocking cradles. It's colic, all right, she thought, recognizing the pattern from altitude changes. In her career, she had treated similar cases, blending medical knowledge with folk wisdom passed down from her grandmother. Rising slowly, Dorothy felt the pull of duty. She wasn't one to ignore suffering, especially a child's. Her economy neighbors glanced curiously as she excused herself, stepping into the aisle with quiet determination. The plains divide was more than physical. It was societal, but Dorothy had crossed such lines before, entering mansions through service doors yet leaving indelible marks. As she approached the curtain, her heart steadied. She knew what to do, even if the world ahead might not welcome her. Dorothy's steps were measured as she navigated the narrow aisle, the cries growing louder with each pace. The economy section faded behind her, a world of budget travelers replaced by the scent of luxury perfumes and fine leather. At the curtain, a flight attendant stood guard, his uniform crisp, his smile polite but unyielding. "Ma'am, this area is restricted to first-class passengers," he said, blocking her path. Dorothy met his gaze evenly, her voice soft yet firm. "That baby has colic. I can help." The attendant hesitated, glancing back at the chaos. "We appreciate your concern, but protocol—" Dorothy cut in gently. "Protocol won't calm that child. I've raised more babies than years you've been alive." Behind the curtain, the tension boiled. The blonde passenger gestured wildly. "This is ridiculous. I demand compensation." Richard rocked Lucas desperately, his face a mask of defeat. Other passengers chimed in, their complaints a cacophony blending with the cries. Dorothy peered past the attendant, seeing the father's anguish, the kind she had eased in countless homes. "Let me through," she insisted, her tone brooking no refusal. The attendant wavered, his training clashing with the evident crisis. Finally, he stepped aside slightly. Just for a moment. As Dorothy entered first class, heads turned, whispers rippling like waves. Who was this elderly black woman in modest clothes daring to invade their space? The blonde sneered. "Now economy is sending reinforcements?" Dorothy ignored her, focusing on Lucas, whose purple face and spasming body confirmed her diagnosis. Richard looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "Can you really help?" Dorothy nodded. "Yes, sir. May I?" But before he could respond, the attendant intervened again. "Ma'am, please return!" Richard's voice boomed. "Let her try!" The confrontation escalated as Margaret Whitmore, a socialite in pearls, interjected sharply. "This is preposterous. Security." Dorothy recognized her instantly, the woman who had fired her years ago over a false accusation. Old wounds stirred, but Dorothy stood tall, her dignity unshakable. The passengers' hostility thickened, murmurs of intruder and know your place floating in the air. Yet Dorothy's presence was a quiet force, her experience a shield against their barbs. The flight attendant, caught in the crossfire, radioed the captain, but Dorothy pressed on. "That boy's in pain. 5 minutes, that's all I need." Richard, desperate, nodded vigorously. The blonde huffed. "Unbelievable." As Dorothy reached for Lucas, the divide between classes cracked, prejudice clashing with necessity in a moment that would unravel secrets and shatter illusions. Margaret Whitmore's eyes narrowed as recognition dawned, her Botoxed face twisting in disdain. "Dorothy Washington? Still meddling, I see." The words dripped with venom, echoing through the cabin. Dorothy paused, the past flooding back. 15 years ago, she had nannied for Margaret's family, saving young Thomas from choking, only to be accused of theft and dismissed without apology. The bracelet was later found, but Margaret's pride prevented amends. Now, in this airborne arena, old grievances resurfaced. Richard glanced between them, confused. "You know each other?" Margaret smirked. "She was my nanny. Adequate for basics, but hardly expert." Dorothy breathed deeply, recalling her mother's wisdom. "Rise above. Mrs. Whitmore, I saved your son's life once. Remember?" Margaret flushed. "Ancient history. This requires professionals." The blonde leaned in, intrigued by the drama. Dorothy's composure held, her voice steady. "Professional or not, that baby needs help now." The exchange drew the cabin's attention, passengers sensing deeper undercurrents. Margaret pressed. "Return to your seat, Dorothy. You're out of place." The racism was veiled but palpable, stinging like old scars. Dorothy replied, "Place? Suffering has no class." Richard intervened. "Enough. If she can help, she stays." Margaret's facade cracked, her manipulation failing amid witnesses. As Lucas wailed anew, Dorothy's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about the baby. It was reclaiming dignity long denied. Margaret's cruelty, once private, now played out publicly, setting the stage for a reckoning. Dr. Patricia Chun, the pediatrician, stepped forward amid the standoff. "I'm a doctor. Let me examine him." Margaret beamed. Finally, expertise. Dr. Chun checked Lucas thoroughly, diagnosing severe colic. Dorothy interjected respectfully, "It's altitude colic with reflux." Margaret scoffed. "Primitive notions." But Dr. Chun listened, intrigued by Dorothy's description of a specific massage technique. Ignoring Margaret's barbs, slave hut remedies, Dorothy demonstrated, positioning Lucas with precise pressure. Miraculously, the cries ceased. The cabin fell silent, awe replacing hostility. Dr. Chun gasped. "Incredible." Richard's gratitude overflowed. "How?" Dorothy explained humbly, her method blending experience and science. Margaret's prejudice was exposed, her comments drawing gasps. Richard rebuked her sharply, as Lucas smiled. Dorothy's act not only soothed the baby but dismantled barriers, proving worth beyond wealth. The calm allowed truths to surface. Dr. Chun queried Dorothy's technique, leading to the bombshell. "I'm Dorothy Washington, retired neonatal nurse. Developer of Washington Syndrome protocols." Gasps echoed. Richard recognized her from saving a senator's twins. Dr. Chun exclaimed, "You're a legend." Margaret paled, her past actions haunting her. Dorothy detailed her career, from hospital innovations to private care, including Margaret's family. The false accusation was revealed, shaming Margaret further. Apologies faltered, but Dorothy's grace shone, emphasizing competence over revenge. The revelation transformed perceptions, turning Dorothy from intruder to icon, underscoring themes of overlooked expertise and prejudices months later. Dorothy received awards, collaborated with Dr. Chun, and consulted for Richard's foundation. A viral video exposed Margaret's racism, ruining her reputation. Dorothy's story inspired, proving dignity and kindness triumph. Lucas grew knowing true heroes transcend classes, a lesson in humanity's boundless potential.